Now, we all know that dealing with BPD can be extremely stressful at times. And if you add the pressures of university life on top of that, if you're a student, you know how demanding and challenging that can be. So today I want to spend some time talking about tips and tricks on how to navigate BPD while in university. So if that sounds good to you, be sure to stick around. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kayla, this is Tuna, and I release new videos about BPD every Monday. So if that sounds good to you, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below as well as the bell notification up top. Now, as I had just mentioned, I want to talk about student life for someone who has BPD. The reason being is that we are now in April, and April typically is when we have exams, at least in Canada. And so I thought that this would be a good time to talk about how difficult it can be to have BPD as a student and how to manage the symptoms while also navigating the difficulties and pressures of being in university. When looking at BPD from an outsider's perspective, it can be difficult to understand why we do the things that we do, why we feel the way that we do, why we have this perspective about the world and different things that we encounter. But for us, for people who struggle with it, we know how all-consuming this can be. Now, if you're in university or college, you may have started off school really strong. You were very passionate and invested in your studies, and after a while, maybe you experience paralyzing anxiety, which makes it impossible to attend lectures, and that really influences your grades and your performance negatively. Or maybe you lose interest because you don't know who you are. So then you end up switching programs, switching degrees, looking for an escape, maybe switching universities, switching cities. So that can be problematic as a student as well. Or maybe you start going to class and you start feeling as though your professors or your classmates don't like you. This triggers your fear of abandonment and stops you from progressing altogether. There are a number of triggers which may influence a person who has BPD to be unsuccessful in university. So things like I had just mentioned. So being impulsive, right? So making impulsive decisions, maybe being impulsive in going out, drinking too much, so not taking the time to study, lacking this clear sense of self. If we don't know who we are, we're going to be studying something and we might feel like this is not right. And so we end up switching, and it's really hard to commit to one thing, and it can make it either impossible to finish our degrees or they end up taking forever. And even when we finish them, we don't feel satisfied. So there's this impulsivity, there's this lack of sense of self, the self-destructive behaviors too, right? So the excessive drinking, the self-harm can be distractions from your studies. Obviously, things like anxiety and depression, we know regardless if you have BPD, if you're depressed, it's really hard to motivate yourself to stay focused, to be engaged, to feel excited by things, and anxiety can lead to extreme procrastination. So just because you're too stressed out, waiting until the last second, or it can lead to consuming your mind and where you're always thinking about everything that needs to be done. So we see that from the simple symptoms of BPD, there's a lot of them, if not most of them, even like the interpersonal relationships, so difficulty with those. If you have difficulties with maintaining friendships or engaging with people, all of that combined and even independently can make the university experience that much more difficult. And when you add someone who has a mixture of all of those things or almost all of those things, well, imagine trying to study, imagine trying to focus your energy on something when you have a hard time just managing yourself. Okay, so now the million-dollar question is, how can we improve our university experience to help us deal better with stressful times such as exams, which might be coming up for some of you? The first thing I will recommend is, of course, only if you feel safe, would be to disclose your disorder. The nice thing about universities now is that before, it was only really if you had more of like a physical disability, a learning disability that made it difficult for you to engage as a student, that you were allowed special permission, so maybe more time for writing exams and tests. Now, a lot of universities are acknowledging that mental disorders fall into those categories. So if you feel safe, you could disclose your diagnosis and say, hey, you know what, I have this. BPD for me is really associated with, I have a lot of anxiety. I feel depressed all the time. It's really hard for me to motivate myself to get going. So maybe if you disclose, then your university will actually allow you more time to write exams and have them deferred. So that would allow you to better manage your anxieties and stress. And when you're writing your exams, to not be hyper focused on, I only have 3 hours, right? You could have a full 8 hours to write something, to take breaks, to de-stress, to eat snacks, to do whatever you need that makes you feel more comfortable and that allows you to perform better within that context. The second thing I will recommend is to have a realistic plan for your workload and planning out your time well. Now, for this though, you need to know yourself. If you know that you are someone who is very driven by validation and needs to perform at 150 all the time and this burns you out, then maybe having a full workload, a full 5 courses per semester is too much for you because you're going to be burnt out. Ultimately, even if you're only taking 1 or 2 courses per semester and you're a part-time student, you're still moving forward. It's not like you're doing nothing. You're still progressing towards that degree. It might just take you longer, and that's okay. And this is why it's really important to know yourself, to know how you operate, how you handle difficulties and change. Something else that still falls into this category about planning time is using devices. So Google Calendar, agendas, reminders on your phone. So having outlets to take some of the pressure outside of your brain. For me, I tend to be very anxious and spend a lot of time thinking about all my to-dos and everything that I need to do. As a student, I found it very useful to start writing those things out, planning my weeks and seeing, okay, what are things that I'm really stressing about, but really that doesn't need to get done for another 4 to 5 weeks. I can scratch that out, right? So writing out your anxieties and insecurities can be a good way and can help you plan out your days better. If you have the opposite problem where you're lacking motivation, same thing. Okay, if people in general waited until they felt motivated to do stuff, then we would never get anything done. And so when you have your calendar and you schedule blocks, right, in your Google Cal or in your agenda, take it as like a work day, right? You can't miss work. You can't miss that study period. So knowing yourself, taking less courses if that makes you feel more safe and makes you feel less anxious about the whole process, and using methods to help you plan out your time. That is the second recommendation that I have to help you better navigate the pressures of university and the stresses of things like exams. The third thing would be to create a supportive living environment. So we really, really want to emphasize being supported by people who care about us and who want the best for us. If you're someone who has social anxiety and doesn't function well with other people, then maybe moving into a dorm with strangers that you don't know their cleanliness habits, their study habits, if they party a lot, is not the best solution, okay? We need to consider what is best for us. So maybe moving in with your friend who is respectful and who shares similar values and similar study and living patterns as you would be beneficial. Or maybe staying at home is the best alternative. Sometimes people don't want to do this because they think, well, I'm old, I shouldn't be living at home. But if this is going to help relieve some of that financial pressure, which maybe otherwise would be something that's constantly weighing on your mind and creating more anxieties and more pressures when it comes to university, then maybe opting for living at home would be the best scenario. So just making sure that you're well surrounded, well supported, that you're in an environment that is conducive to positive emotions to help lower those BPD symptoms, right? Don't purposely live with people that you know trigger you all the time, that are super messy or they party a lot, and that this would create anxiety for you. As fun as that may seem, we need to think about the bigger picture of what's best for us. Having time off is also something that's super important, okay? As amazing as it is to work on ourselves and to better ourselves and go to therapy and do all those things, if you're doing all of that on top of working, on top of being a student, on top of having your own social life and time to self, that's too much, okay? You need to schedule times in your calendar where you take a break from everything. You take a break from working, from being a student, from bettering yourself, right? Days off from therapy, just chunks of time, even if it's a few hours to yourself to do whatever it is that you want. If you just want one day, so every Sunday you have nothing on the calendar where you just watch Netflix all day and that's kind of your recharge, do that, right? Personally, I don't do anything at night unless I have obligations, of course, like for my practicum where my hours are later. But I don't do anything. I don't do schoolwork. I don't do personal creative YouTube stuff. I don't do that in the evenings to really let myself have the time to decide what I want to do. If I want to be social, if I need time to myself, if I need time to just like binge watch a show and that's it, and no one talks to me, that's good. So scheduling time off is an awesome way also to help deal with the pressures of university. And something else too, I'm not sure, I think I'm at the fourth or fifth suggestion, is to keep everything in perspective, okay? Perspective in the sense that you might feel like everything is the end of the world, but just kind of zooming out and realizing that others are struggling too with you along the way. You're not the only student who is really stressed. You're not the only person also in university who has BPD, who has to deal with things that you're going through. So keeping that in perspective, also keeping in the perspective that sometimes things happen and we feel like it's the end of the world, but ultimately we gain different things from them. So just having an open mind that maybe this is really difficult and tragic right now, but perhaps in the future other things might come out of it. And that other piece to keeping the perspective is also always reassessing what you're doing. Just because one thing worked for you one semester, it doesn't mean that it will work for you in the future. For example, if one semester your mental health, you were doing really well and you're able to take a full course load, that's awesome. But then when you come back in the fall, you're feeling depressed and burnt out, don't repeat the full course load because you're at a different stage of what you need. So always reassessing, putting things into perspective to make sure that we're keeping in mind our needs in that moment. And the last thing I will recommend is to discuss your plan with someone that you trust. So whether that's a therapist, an academic advisor, so your friends, your family. So making sure that you have this person who's a bit unbiased or not as biased to help indicate whether or not your plan is realistic, whether or not you have good strategies, good study tips and tricks. So having someone else help you look at your plan to help you assess your blind spots. Let me know in the comments down below what has worked for you. So if you have any study tips or tricks, things that might help others who are currently students and are also working through their own BPD symptoms. So you can just leave a comment down below. I always respond and read to all of them. And the last thing is, if you want to support my channel, I really encourage you to share my videos. That's the best way to get the message out there. The more people see this, the more that we help to break down stigma about BPD. And this is really the goal of this channel. On that note, thanks so much for being here with me today, and I will see you next time for another episode of On the Line.